I'm Gwyneth Mallon. I'm the director of NYU Center for the Humanities, and I'm very pleased to welcome you all here to this event this evening. And that's on behalf of our staff at the center. That's Chris Alexander, Denny Valentin, and our student assistants, Alexander Martinez and Janina Soriano, and our faculty co-directors, Jane Tylis and Uli Baer. So thank you on behalf of all of us for being here tonight. Tonight, we're going to examine the state of the field of global modernism. And this event is the launch of a 2-year working research group funded by our center, which Laurie Cole and Kelly Sullivan are co-directing. So the reason for establishing this working group at this time is in response to this moment when the study of modernism is expanding and evolving in new ways. This working research group is going to welcome faculty and students to analyze cultural production from, 1890 to 1950. Okay, sounds good. And to come together and to discuss their research. And tonight is sort of the kickoff event for that working research group that will last for 2 years' time. Laurie Cole and Kelly Sullivan are going to serve as the moderators this evening. They're also, as I mentioned, the co-directors of this working research group. And so I'm just going to briefly introduce the two of them and then just turn the evening over to both of them. Laurie Cole, seated here, is an assistant professor, faculty fellow in the Draper program at NYU, where she teaches art history. She received her PhD in comparative literature from NYU and was a postdoctoral fellow at Brandeis University from 2012 to 2014. Her writing has appeared in Art Forum, Cabinet, the Journal of Art Historiography, the Oxford Critical and Cultural History of Modernist magazines. She is currently writing a book about questionnaires issued on art and national identity across Europe and the Americas in the early 20th century. Kelly Sullivan, at the other end of the table, is assistant professor, faculty fellow in Irish studies, also here at NYU. She received her PhD in British and Irish literature from Boston College. Her research interests are in literary modernism, the connections between literary and visual art movements in the 20th century, and contemporary Irish poetry. Her book project, Epistolary Modernism, looks at fictional letters in literature from the 1920s to the Second World War, and argues that late modernist writers felt a renewed commitment to the purpose and principles of literature as public speech, even as they saw privacy curtailed and surveillance increased. So it's very exciting to have two important junior faculty with us, and very bold of them, actually, to step up and start this research collaborative. So we're very pleased to have them both here this evening as our moderators. They put together this panel of experts for you. And so I'm going to turn it over to both of them. Laurie and Kelly, it's to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Gwyneth, and I want to thank the staff of the NYU Center for the Humanities for all of your support in organizing this event, and thank Kelly, my co-organizer, as well, for her work. And also, I'd love to thank all of our panelists. Thank you for so generously donating your time and your expertise to be with us tonight. And lastly, thank you all for coming. So welcome to Global Modernism, State of the Field. Tonight, we're analyzing the global shift in modernist studies, which has been happening for about a decade or so. So coining the term New Modernist Studies in a 2008 PMLA essay, Rebecca Walkowitz and Douglas Mao identified what they called a transnational turn, and we can talk about these different terminology as well, in scholarship, as well as a spatial expansion of modernism to address what they called the complex intellectual and economic transactions among Europe, Africa, the United States, and the Caribbean, among other places. So this transnational turn in scholarship examines how artists and writers formed collaborative networks, which was often abetted by new developments in technology and media, and how they incorporated their experiences of travel and migration into their work, leading to new forms and strategies for representation. However, one of the challenges, I would argue, posed by this model of modernist studies is how difficult it is to encompass the full range of cultural production produced in different languages, in a variety of locations, in a variety of media, across the Americas, Africa, Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. And I think that we all resolve these challenges differently in our research and in our teaching, and I'll be curious to hear what the panelists have to say about that. So our hope in bringing together tonight's panelists who work in multiple geographies and disciplines is really to collectively address the complexities of the field as it becomes increasingly global. So we're really posing this new shift in the field as a kind of question to our panelists. And Kelly will tell you a little bit more about what to expect for tonight's event and tell you more also about the Global Modernisms Group. which is launching tonight.
Okay, thanks. So I just want to repeat Lori's thank you to the Center for the Humanities, to Gwyneth, and to all of you for coming out tonight, and to our panelists for being here tonight. I'm also going to echo a little bit of what Gwyneth said about the Global Modernisms Group, that you have to hold this very, very close to your mouth. So this does mark the launch of the Global Modernisms Group, and what we hope to do is that we hope to be able to continue to address the questions that we raised tonight. This is an interdisciplinary research group, and we're hoping to include a reading series, a works in progress program, and also a database of lectures and events on modernism in the New York City area. So if you're interested in being involved in the group, we'd love to have you. There's a sign-up sheet out, hopefully you saw on your way in, but if you didn't sign up on that sheet or RSVP for this event, please do if you're interested in being on our mailing list. And we're hoping to have an event sometime in December that will help us to plan future events for next spring as well. So the hope of the Global Modernisms Group in general is to bring together scholars from a variety of different fields. Lori and I met at an event here at NYU, and we realized we were both interested in modernism, but we probably never would have even met each other had we not happened to be sitting next to each other at randomly at an event. So our hope is that we can bring people from different backgrounds and different disciplines together and talk and have a kind of a communal discussion about the state of modernist studies and modernist literature, poetry, art, and cinema, across the globe, or the planet, as some people have been saying. So for tonight's panelists, we ask, what makes modernism global? What form does this take in your own research? And what are the implications of this shift in modernist scholarship and pedagogy? The format that we're going to use today is I'll introduce all of the panelists one after the other, and then I will turn it over to them in alphabetical order to talk for 5 or so minutes about their own work. And then we'll pose some questions to the panelists and hopefully have a discussion. And as soon as we can, we will also open questions up to the audience too. So I hope you guys came with some questions for the panelists. And when you ask your questions, you have to pretty much put the microphone in your mouth. It's really awkward. Okay, so our first panelist is Robin Cresswell. Robin is assistant professor of comparative literature at Yale University and poetry editor of the Paris Review. His research focuses on poetic modernisms in English, French, and Arabic. He's currently a fellow at the New York Institute for the Humanities at NYU, Berlin Prize Fellow for the spring of 2016. Our second panelist, Matthew Itaw, is assistant professor of English and Global Studies at Baruch College, CUNY, where he teaches post-colonial and modernist literature. He is the assistant editor of the Oxford Handbook of Global Modernisms and currently working on 2 book projects. The first is Long Waves of Modernity, Global History, the World System, and the Making of the Anglophone Novel, 1880 to 2010. And his second book project is Open for Business, A Literary History of the Corporation in Africa, 1945 to present. Our third panelist, Erica Moaya James, is assistant professor jointly appointed in the departments of the History of Art and African American Studies at Yale University. Before joining Yale, she was the founding director and chief curator of the National Art Gallery of the Bahamas. Her first book, After Caliban, Caribbean Art in the Global Imaginary, is under review, and she has begun work on a second manuscript, Historicizing the Global in Caribbean Art and Visual Culture. She is currently a fellow at the Whitney Humanities Center at Yale. Our next panelist is Effie Rentsu, who is an associate professor of French literature in the Department of French and Italian at Princeton University. She's currently working on a second book, tentatively titled Concepts of the World, Avant-garde and the Idea of the International, that explores the conceptualization of the world in the work and activities of writers and artists within and around historical avant-garde movements during the period 1900 to 1940. And our last panelist, Robert Stam, is university professor at New York University. He has co-authored, and edited some 17 books on film and cultural theory, national cinema, both French and Brazilian, as well as comparative race and post-colonial studies. His next project concerns transnational cinema and media, and he has a new book out just this week, which is, it's weekly, the book production, which is Keywords in Subversive Film Media Aesthetics. So I'm going to turn this over to Robin to start us off. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you, everyone, for coming out. Do I have to put this in my mouth, too, or is this all right? Is all right about this? All right. Okay. So a lot of my recent work has focused on modernism in Arabic poetry, which is a movement that happens in Lebanon in basically the 3 decades after the Second World War and before the beginning of the Civil War in Lebanon in 1975. And the movement is not particularly well known in American academia. The transnational turn has not yet arrived, and modernist studies has not yet arrived in the Middle East, that's for sure. I was recently leafing through the 2 volumes of essays on modernist studies edited by a guy named Eystensen, an Icelandic scholar, which included essays on modernism in the Faroe Islands, but nothing from the Middle East, from the entire Middle East, in fact. So anyway, I wanted to give a very brief description of what this modernist movement was, and then say something about how my work on this particular modernism has kind of affected the way that I think about modernism in general and the state of modernist studies. So the modernist movement in Beirut, in Lebanon, is really a classical example of the phenomenon, and it was self-consciously so, which is to say, these were poets who called themselves modernists. And it was a gathering of exiles and emigres in West Beirut, in a neighborhood called Hamra, and basically between 1955 and 1975, which one sociologist has called the closest the Arab world ever got to having its own Greenwich Village. And probably the most famous among these exiles is a poet named Adonis, who is still alive, who's a Syrian Lebanese poet, who's now been pretty extensively translated into English and much more extensively translated into French. And the modernists, they established a magazine, a very influential magazine, an art gallery. They wrote manifestos, they questioned the art of the past, and they wrote some poetry that Arab readers found extremely difficult initially to understand. So, as I say, a pretty familiar version of the modernist phenomenon. A little bit of historical context. This post-war period is a moment when Beirut becomes really the center of print culture in the Middle East, usurping the place which had hitherto been held by Cairo. And it became a kind of refuge for intellectuals from all over the region, many of whom were fleeing their own countries for political reasons. So in Egypt, this is the moment when Nasserism comes to the fore, and in Syria and Iraq, the 2 major countries on the borders of Lebanon, this is the period of Baathism, and intellectuals who were not in sync with, not in agreement with these ideological regimes, which were mobilizing intellectuals in a very kind of concerted way, often ended up in Beirut. It was a kind of home for people without a home. And it was also the case that a lot of Palestinians who were fleeing the Nakba in 1948 also ended up in Beirut during this period. So it was this kind of golden age in print culture. And Lebanon itself is a country with a very weak state, which means that censorship laws were very lax. And so it was this efflorescence, this kind of golden period, as I say. There's a very famous saying kind of that stakes out the intellectual geography of the Middle East, which is Cairo writes, Beirut publishes, Baghdad reads. And at least in terms of the publishing part of it, it's true about Beirut. And this saying actually dates back to this period that I'm talking about. So the modernists grouped themselves around a magazine, which was called Sha'r, which means poetry. And it was named after Harriet Monroe's famous little magazine of the same name based in Chicago, which still exists, although nobody, I think, would call it a modernist magazine anymore. One of the editors had encountered poetry during a long stay in New York during the 1950s. The magazine published, it lasted for 11 years. It published 44 issues. It was a quarterly. And it published manifestos, translations of European and American poetry, criticism, letters from abroad. Their foreign correspondent in the United States was Omar Shakespeare Pound, the son of Ezra Pound, although he doesn't actually seem to have filed any letters with them, but he was at least claimed as their American correspondent. So it was this very aggressively internationalist magazine. And internationalism was one of the ways in which it defined its own modernity. And this was in very sharp opposition to cultural groups in the region, which tended to be, during this period, nationalist groups. Even Marxist tendencies were really, I would say, nationalist. And in the eyes of the modernists, these nationalist Marxist groups were therefore very parochial in their tastes and attitudes. And interestingly, at least for scholars of comparative literature like me, these Beiruti modernists, they constantly defined their cosmopolitan ambition as a desire for Arabic literature to become part of world literature. And that was the phrase that they used, al-adab al-alami, world literature, which was actually a catchphrase of the post-war period. Some people think anyway, that it's kind of a recent vintage, or else that it just goes back to Goethe. But it's a catchphrase of the post-war period. It's when Auerbach's famous essay comes out. We're talking about the same period there. So world literature. And the group has essentially two slogans, I would say. This is kind of a shorthand, but basically internationalism and the autonomy of the poetic. So poetry, the title of the magazine, really means poetry and nothing else. No politics. That's what it means for them. And these commitments, I think, were actually are best thought of as really like two sides of the same coin, which is to say, poetry has to, or culture in general, really, it was a cultural argument. Culture has to be released from its moorings in national culture in order to become part of this basically deracinated corpus of international depoliticized texts, which is what they call world literature. And so I think among the reasons for studying Arabic modernism, or at least for me that's been interesting, is the light that it throws on the history of this concept. Because, discussions invariably return to Goethe when they're talking about world literature. But my own feeling is that the modernist variant of what world literature means is much more relevant in the present, actually. And certainly this triangle of literary autonomy, internationalism, and arrayed against basically national politics is the schema of, for instance, Pascal Casanova's The World Republic of Letters. That is the kind of conceptual schema of it, and that's a very much, I would say, a late modernist way of thinking about the way literature exists in the world. But I would also say that I think this notion of modernism as an internationalist movement guided by this non-ideological ideology of autonomy is really a standard way of defining what modernism means in the post-war period. It's true of African modernist movements who are centered around magazines like Black Orpheus and Transition. It's very much true of what Octavio Paz means when he talks about modernism in the Mexican or Latin American context. So the first thing that actually studying modernism through the particular lens or the peculiar lens of the Beiruti movement has convinced me of is the necessity for distinguishing, and I think there's a distinction that many of us do make already, distinguishing between modernist movements of the early 20th century, mostly the teens and the 20s, and those that arise after World War II. I think they're entirely different phenomenons. The early high modernist movements have, I think, really no common denominator. They come from the political left, they come from the political right, some are internationalist, some are nationalist, and most of them do not call themselves modernist. They call themselves vorticists or imagists or simultaneous or surrealists or futurists, but they don't call themselves modernists for the most part, except in the Latin American case. Pound's slogan is "Make it new, not make it modern." He had very little to say about modernism, actually. It's really in the post-war period that modernism becomes codified as modernism. And this is why it's not really a surprise that these Arab poets are calling themselves modernists, because this is when a kind of canon begins to form. It's a flexible canon with variations in each national context. But it does have a common denominator. This would be my argument, at least. It does have a common denominator, which is that of aesthetic autonomy. And I think the story of how that happens in the post-war period is a very interesting and complicated one, and it has, again, lots of variants, and we could talk about it further. So this is what it means, I think, when we talk about late modernism. It's this moment of tremendous contraction in terms of ideological specification. Like all the movements basically have the same ideology. But it's also this vertiginous expansion in geographical terms. And it's the first time I think that actually modernism becomes, it's in the post-war period I think that modernism becomes a global literary ideology. And I'm probably already over time because I know this is only supposed to be 5 minutes. I'll just say two very brief things. Again, that studying the Beiruti movement has convinced me of. One is the importance of magazine culture. I mean, this is really a movement that is centered on the magazines and where all the debates of the era were really hatched. And I think the magazines are the primary sources for studying most modernist movements. They're the archives. They're the archives of modernism. And if the movement that you're studying is not centered around a magazine, it's probably not a modernist one. But of course, studying magazines is a tricky business. We don't really know how to read them yet, because what are these objects that are collectively authored? They have advertisements in them. Is a text representative of the whole? What does it mean when they have dedicated readerships, when the editorial policy can shift over time? So they're very tricky objects to know how to read, and a lot of scholarship, good scholarship, I think, has started to go into this, like the Modernist Journals Project at Brown, and these massive Oxford anthologies of essays about modernism in the 19th and 20th centuries. So magazine culture. And the last thing I'll just say is it's convinced me of studying these Arab poets is the importance of translation. I'll just say very briefly, this magazine that I'm studying, Sherad Poetry Magazine, it published a really, really remarkable range of verse and translation. Whitman, Pound, Crane, Eliot, Valéry, Michaud, Bonnefoy, Saint-Jean-Perse. Saint-Jean-Perse is all over the place in the mid-century moment, I think. He's one of the great poets who's been totally forgotten. But recovering this kind of late modernist moment shows, I think, how really significant he was at a certain moment, even though now, outside of the Caribbean context, he really is somewhat forgotten. Anyway, Spanish language poetry, Ungaretti, Ben, Rilke. The first issue of the magazine had a translation into Arabic of Ezra Pound's first canto, which itself is the translation of a Latin translation of Homer. So really, translation was just kind of a manifesto for translation, I think. So translation was very much at the center of this movement. And I think that it's often kind of lazily thought that, some interest in translation has to do with the dialogue of cultures or something like that. I think it's very important in all cases of modernist movement to see, what translations are picked. So, for instance, in this Beiruti movement, there's this real interest in translating poems that have to do with the sea. Rimbaud's Le Bateau Ivre, Yeats' Sailing to Byzantium, the first song of L'Autre Amance, Chant de Mal d'Aurore, the old ocean part of it, the first canto of Pound, and then went down to the ships, it's a ship poem. Perse's Amer, which is sea marks. Anyway, so, as opposed to most modernist groups, which are really interested, of course, we think of as being very interested in city life, of urban life, this Lebanese phenomenon is entirely interested in the sea. There are ideological reasons for that in the Lebanese context, because they were thinking of themselves as a Mediterranean group rather than one which with its roots in the interior, in the kind of desertified interior. So, in any case, it's important to think about, and I think to note, when looking at translations, what's getting translated, and why are these getting translated and not other things? So those are the three things I just wanted to point out, and I'll be very interested to hear what my colleagues have to say. Thank you.
Let's see. Closer? Works? Maybe. How's that? Good? Okay. So first thing to say is that I think a lot of what I have to say here is actually going to echo what Robin just said, particularly in the fact that I also think that if we're going to think about global modernism, and if we're going to think about modernism as something that's happening on a global scale, that we actually have to look to the post-war period. And I'm going to actually look a little bit further into the future and think a little bit more about some things that are happening in Africa, and particularly South Africa, in the 1970s and the 1980s. And in places where maybe autonomy is not exactly the key term for modernism, but I think ethics is, and particularly the relationship between ethics and form. So Lori and Kelly asked us to talk a little bit or to reflect a little bit about methodology, as well as how the methodology of global modernism might fit into our own research. And so I'm going to start with methodology. I'm going to talk a little bit about the term global modernism, what I think it is, how I think it's come about. Then I'm going to try to fold that back into some of the research that I do, particularly about African modernism. So first of all, I think it's important that when we talk about this quote-unquote global turn in modernist studies, that we always think about this term dialectically. So on the one hand, modernism has traditionally operated as a label for a specific aesthetic style that emerged in certain definite historical context and certain cultural context, however we ultimately define that style and however we ultimately periodize it. On the other hand, modernism has never just been an aesthetic term, but has also, and perhaps primarily, been a critical term for that style, one which has traditionally been bound up with the institutionalization of various types of literature within the university. And this speaks to somewhat of what Robin was saying about the fact that the modernists didn't call themselves modernists, right? The high modernists, I think we should clarify, never spoke of themselves as modernist. And so, this term modernism first emerges as a term, say, that the new critics are using to canonize modernist poetry in the academy. But that comes all the way down to post-colonial literature. Simon Gaikonde reminds us that post-colonial literature was really institutionalized within the academy under the rubric of modernism, that the initial post-colonial texts were brought into the academy because they in some ways resembled modernist form. They were experimental, or they were doing something similarly in terms of their formal structure to what high modernism was doing. So what this means is that when we speak of a quote-unquote global modernism, we're not talking about some kind of empirically visible set of texts that we've just stumbled on in recent years, or at least I don't think that we are. Rather, we're talking about a group of texts that have become modernist in part because of changing critical definitions of what it means to be modernist. And this is why I say we need to think about this term dialectically, that we need to think about modernism both as a particular set of texts that we're looking at and as a critical discourse that we're using, and that's morphing over time. So it's this change in the definition of modernism that I really want to talk about today. And obviously my comments are going to be more elusive than substantive, given the time allotted. This is just one of the characteristics of the roundtable. But what I can say about these changing definitions is that they have something to do with the international division of intellectual labor, something to do with changing regimes of critical labor in the academy, and something to do with the rise of what I'm going to be calling a certain type of formalist ethics. And so these are the three kind of key terms that I want to be placing in a dialogue here. Intellectual labor, the academy, and formalist ethics. The relation between this little cluster of terms starts to become clear if we look at two influential statements about modernism and African literature. The first of these is by the Nigerian scholars Chinweyezu, Onwukeke Jeme, and Ihekuku Madubuike, and comes from their 1983 volume Toward the Decolonization of African Literature. Quote, "Our study demonstrates the mutilations that genres of African writing have suffered under the Euromodernist dispensation. Such writers have encouraged the manufacture of a stiff, pale, anemic, academic poetry, slavishly imitative of 20th century European modernism, with its weak preciosity, ostentatious erudition, and dunghill piles of esoterica and obscure allusions, all totally cut off from the vital nourishment of our African traditions and home soil." So I really love the polemicism of this argument, right, or of this particular statement. Modernism is evil, basically. The second statement is by the South African critic Derek Attridge, and was written in the early 2000s. Quote, "My argument is merely that within what is called modernism, technical resources and a certain attitude to the operations of language and discourse were evolved that would make possible a new openness and alertness to modalities of otherness. In later developments of modernism, these resources have been exploited in conjunction with a thematic interest in gender, race, and colonialism to stage, confront, apprehend, and explore otherness." So it should be immediately apparent that Chinweyezu and Attridge's definitions of modernism are almost diametrically opposite. Where Chinweyezu characterizes modernism as specificity, sedimentation, and resistance to non-European cultures, Attridge characterizes it instead as indeterminacy, newness, and an ethical openness to marginalized cultures. What I find most interesting here is how a historical statement about the geography of literary forms has suddenly transformed itself into a political statement about the ethics of modernist form. In the transition that we see from Chinweyezu and company's quote-unquote Afrocentric critique of modernism to Attridge's more affirmative statement, the becoming African of modernism is bound up with the becoming ethical of modernism, such that it is only when modernism is redescribed as a fundamentally ethical project that it becomes visible as an African form. And I really want to point out there's no essential connection here. We don't need to think about the global spread of modernism as necessarily being connected to ethics. We could see it as a purely aesthetic project, but that's not necessarily how African literature in particular has received modernism or has defended its interest in modernism. It's usually been through the lens of ethics. And again, this is not necessarily how high modernism would have talked about modernism, right? It's a very different language. It's a much more contemporary language, I would say. So unfortunately, I don't have the time to fully flesh out the entire history of how this came to be. Apologies. But what I can say about this shift is that it was at least in part related to new developments in the global distribution of creative and academic labor. In the 20 years that separated Chinweyezu and Attridge's statements, civil war and structural readjustment all but destroyed the Afrocentric National University, which for much of the 20th century had provided a home to African writers from across the continent. These developments helped to contribute to a global migration of intellectual labor from the national universities of the global south to the universities of the global north. And I would say this is a dispensation that we're still living in today, that this is kind of our contemporary moment, where intellectual labor has been largely consolidated within, say, the US and European university. So during this period, what we see is that many African writers who migrated to Europe and the American university end up adopting modernist stylistic techniques, in part as a form of cultural capital, legitimating their inclusion in the Northern University, and in part as a way of articulating the complex web of relations binding them to both their national cultures and to the Euro-American university spaces in which they find themselves. And so just to give some concrete examples of the figures I'm thinking about here, I'm thinking of people like Louis Nkosi, Eskia Mafolele, and J.M. Coetzee. I'm primarily interested in South African writing, but I think we could extend this to many other countries in the continent. But all these figures either self-consciously use modernist techniques within their fiction or defend them within their criticism. And I think it's key to think about this both as a movement that's happening within literature and one that's happening within criticism. Many of these figures end up being incorporated into the academy as both literary writers, creative writers, and as critics in their own right. So for all these writers, modernist form is of necessity ethical. It's in these writers' work that we begin to see a critical defense of modernist form as an ethical practice. And it's from these writers, I would argue, that modernist studies has inherited the critical language that would eventually make it possible to see modernism as something that operates on a global scale. And I mean this in two senses. On the one hand, I think we can see this cluster of writers, particularly South African writers, who are using modernism and thinking about modernism in an ethical vein as representative as certain movement towards a type of global modernism, that in some ways they're representative of certain movements that are happening on a global scale. But I also want to make a much more narrow argument here, which is that this debate that picks up in African studies, and particularly within Southern African studies, really does end up influencing the formation of the new modernist studies. If you read some of the canonical works of what we would now think of as global modernist studies, Rebecca Walkowitz's Cosmopolitan Style, Jessica Berman's Modernist Ethics, many of them are going back to Attridge's definition of modernist style and modernism as a type of ethics. And this is something that Attridge is developing in dialogue with Coetzee and in dialogue with many other African critics such as Neil Lazarus and David Atwell, who are trying to rethink what it means to be modernist and to rethink how there could be a specifically African style of modernism and one that's also politically engaged and politically active. So I think I'll leave it there, and I've got much more to say, but might be best to save some of that for the discussion later. Thank you.
I am coming at this from a completely different place, and as I prepared for this session, my reticence at engaging a state of the field conversation became really quite acute, especially in terms of global modernism. And it's because, and I'm going to say I a lot because this is a very subjective position, and it's a position that I think I'm grappling with, and I think you'll get a sense of that from some of what I say. So I will talk a little bit generally about the term and what I think it means in relation to my field, my discipline, the discipline of art history, and my field in particular, and then I'll talk a little bit about a project we're working on right now at Yale. So why my reticence? I actually don't think of global modernism as a field, as much as a useful and, dare I say, necessary approach, method, or consideration within increasingly interdisciplinary fields like art history or interdisciplinary intellectual projects like African American studies, Caribbean studies, diaspora studies. Its thingness for me arises in the process of doing the kind of work. And as such, I think it is central to any field engaged in the production of knowledge if they're interested in attending to a more equitable future. And I want to hold on to this idea of process or method with disciplinary attachments for a while, because it anchors the concept of modernism within particular epistemologies, which I believe the work of global modernities can then break apart. In other words, and it's interesting that you use the word ethics, because for me that centers the process that I engage with this concept. In other words, it tethers it to a kind of intellectual history and ethos, a necessary ethos through which these fields can be made accountable, can be expanded, can continually prepare us for what is to come. Global modernism, from where I sit, seeks to unmoor values, hierarchies, the centrality and rendering of the sightlines of the West within multiple fields. It seeks to decolonize modernism, disciplinary histories, and in turn, history itself. I don't think it's something that can be forced. I'm resistant to applying it in certain ways. My approach is a nonlinear one that articulates through conceptual meaning. And this meaning is sort of becomes apparent on the other side of nation. It works through nation, gender, sexualities, economies, imperial power, all of these other forces and assumed modalities, because temporalities and locations, of course, shift. To draw on C.L.R. James, it is an approach that recognizes borderlines, but doesn't view the intended work of borders as thorough or absolute. We may say it's seamless, we use all of these types of terms, but I'm very much interested in what that means exactly. How are these borders breached? And in my work, I think there's a profound need for a certain sense of specificity. Like many people, from time to time, I engage in a healthy, ongoing fight with the concept of modernism itself. What do we mean by modernism? That global necessarily modifies it or transforms it in a particular way. Is it a time period? Is it a way of life? Is it a kind of humanism with economic and cultural signposts? Is it a kind of self-awareness? But my biggest question, I guess, is as we fall in love with this concept of global modernism has become, are we here in the U.S. able to, in the words of the photographer Dawood Bey, unlock our eyes in order to do the kind of looking, seeing that this approach demands? Are we able to significantly reimagine conceptual signposts in our disciplines that the mere consideration of the term engenders? Are we here in this room willing to do the work that an engagement with this methodological approach or the historical phenomenon it may seek to describe demands? Are institutions and institutional frameworks of the academy, willing to support the work? And I say this because in order to do it well, as Lori indicated earlier, it takes a lot of time, and we need to talk about that. We have to be pretty real about it. I don't think, of course, modernism is a concept restricted to the West, as the work of my colleagues here has shown, but I also think of it as having a deeper history than we give it. So for me, even though the rubrics of this conversation is 1890s to 1940s, my work takes it way back, almost, and the work of some of my colleagues are thinking about this in terms of 15th century work. They are working on, early Chinese, just thinking of globalism in multiple ways. And I think we have to keep that in play. In my work on the global Caribbean, thinking through movement and migrations across boundaries, willing and unwilling, emergent ideas and aesthetics at points of contact, shifting meaning and embodiment in language, artists who embrace the simultaneity of their existence without the attendant chaos that is theorized but not lived, a more global approach to modernities emerged in and through the work itself. I haven't experienced a need in my own work to force the work to say what I want it to say. I don't have to frame it in a way frame it in some way to affect or create or render global modernism. I find that being attendant to the work and being attendant to the object itself, the theory, the histories contained therein sort of emerge, they kind of happen. And the work itself demands it, the kinds of questions I ask in relation to the work. For a project I'm working on now at Yale, during my first days at Yale, I was approached by a colleague about a set of paintings of Haitian leaders that were in the collection of Yale's Peabody Museum. A lovely colleague said to me, knowing that I worked on the Caribbean, "I think you should come look at our Haitian paintings. Tell us what they are exactly and if they're worth anything." Sorry. As an aside, the question of worth, humanity, is an important element in global modernism. And in this case, the fact that in terms of the Western canon, they are not great paintings, hence normally worthy of study. But in the past 3 years of initial research, the lives of these paintings have transformed not only my understanding of circuits of exchange during the 18th and 19th century, transatlantic period in space, but the global scope of it and how medium and value in particular shifted from place to place. A global modernist approach to this work recognizes the points of contact and simultaneously attends to the shift in value from place to place, laterally, not in terms of hierarchy, and certainly not in terms of a fixed center or metropole in relation to the others. For this project, the possibility of global modernisms encourages me to attend to methods of seeing in my discipline and attendant disciplines and fields that have placed these works not in an art museum, but an anthropological museum. I'm also having to contend with my discipline's obsession with originals and pejorative critiques of mimicry applied to most non-European and now non-American cultures that engaged easel painting, for instance, at a particular historical juncture. And I have, again, evoking Dawood Bey and Edward Glissant, had to seek to understand the strategic forms from within the works themselves, including a reconsideration of materiality as a theoretical sort of consideration, recentering the object as point of departure, a placement determined in part by the context of its production and exhibition. What has emerged? And one of the things, at least, that has emerged on a meta level is a reconsideration of the copy in the context of global modernism, but specifically one emanating from Hispaniola and Haiti in the late 18th and early 19th century, and how this may challenge to an extent our understanding of the artist in a Western context, and further en masse the rules of origins. So I'm finding that when one opens oneself up to the possibilities that global modernities can exist, even if it's unnamed, one's attempt to render it through art and objecthood becomes a powerful tool because it has the potential to transform our understanding of histories and particular moments, not only in this case of the island or what is formally understood as the metropole, but all points in between and in relation. Thank you.
Thank you, Lori and Kelly, for inviting me. And some of my comments will overlap with some of the things that were said already. And I will first say a few things about this term, global modernism, then a couple of things about my field, French literature, and then I will focus on the project I'm working on right now and address some methodological issues I think that are there in the term global modernism and were more or less addressed before. But I would like to really start with two quotes from two French authors. The first one is from 1913, and it's from a long poem by the poet Blaise Cendrars, The Prose of the Trans-Siberian. And I read in the English translation, "The world stretches, elongates, and retracts like an accordion tormented by a sadistic hand." The second is from a few years later, from 1926, and is a short description of a sort of a magical place in Louis Aragon's Paris Peasant, and I quote, "I wanted to know if there still existed in the Passage de l'Opéra in Paris a bizarre establishment which Paul Valéry had once described to me, an agency which accepted unstamped letters and arranged to have them posted from any desired point of the globe to the address written on the envelope, a facility that would allow the customer to feign a voyage to the Far East, for example, without moving an inch from the Far West of some secret adventure. Impossible to find anything. The concierge had never heard such a place mentioned. So, in 1913, on the eve of what would be later called the First World War, the well-traveled modernist avant-garde saw the world as a plastic and malleable thing, a thrill of conflicting feelings, of elation and deception, of angst and exhilaration. Aragon, bound more closely to Paris, was intrigued by the possibility of a faint travel around the world, which for him occurred in the secret adventure of Paris itself. Traveling was not necessary. His world could not but be imagined. While these two quotes are informative for my current work on the historical avant-garde and its conceptualization of the global, and I will come back to this in a minute, I think that these quotes also sort of describe the global turn in modernist studies in recent years. Like Sandrar's world, the geographical scope of modernism has expanded, like an accordion, to include up to now neglected archives in Asia, Africa, South America, and the periphery of Europe, and you all addressed this. This expansion has changed our view of the limits and limitations of modernism, but also of its very meaning, as you said. On the other hand, and despite this stretching of the world of modernism, modernist studies as a field mapped out, for instance, in the MSA annual colloquium or in the bulk of relevant publications, often resembles Aragon's strange emporium that promises a tour of the world, but it never leaves home. Steadfastly anchored in the Anglophone paradigm, modernist studies look at the global as a terrain of possibilities, but most often deliver inquiry into the familiar English-speaking domain. And one problem with that is what you said, that there's not enough time to learn all the languages to see everything. I'm sorry. I work on French modernism, which as a field is in a very peculiar position. And this because, according to the books at least, French modernism does not exist. Consider, for instance, the book that Robin mentioned, the monumental 2-volume Modernism, edited by Asador Estensen. The chapter called French Literary Modernism leaves no doubt on this point, and I quote from this chapter, "French literary modernism per se does not exist." In fact, the term modernism has never really been applied to literature in France to designate a literary period, genre, or movement. So we come back to the issue that you mentioned before, that in fact, almost no one of the high modernists was referring to themselves as modernists, but in this monumental work about modernism as a global phenomenon, this is something that is said only about France, for instance, but not about what happened in the Anglophone world. The Cambridge Companion to European Modernism, another book edited by Pericles Lewis, has a similar statement. In the chapter France, we read, and I quote again, "Unlike in other national literatures, such as the Anglo-American tradition, modernism in France does not designate a school or a movement." So what we see here in critical literature, and we can see it pretty much everywhere we look, is a stunning void in current scholarship. French modernism is absent, is missing. And the main peculiarity is that this void, in fact, like many a void, is invisible. For while anything by the name of French modernism is absent from scholarship, this absence is masked by constant references to French modernist authors or works that are fundamental for the aesthetics of modernism in general. So the names of Baudelaire, Rimbaud, and Mallarmé in poetry, and of Proust for prose, are routinely mentioned as founders of and seminal for modernism and representative of its aesthetic. Yet these and a handful of other luminous names seem to stand alone. They're pillars to carry the heft of modernity, but with no edifice to house it. Often one has the strange impression that we jump from Baudelaire to T.S. Eliot and Ezra Pound, or that Proust holds a French soliloquy with Virginia Woolf and James Joyce. Where it is mentioned, French modernism appears more like a hopscotch from one author to the next, without any sense of continuity or tensions, context, or relational nodes. Modernism in France is approached by scholarship as if shattered into fragments, with authors isolated, movements or schools operating independently, genres or media segregated, the elusive meaning of which offers no larger or coherent picture. And actually, Robin, you talked about this when you said that for the first half of 20th century, we have this kind of fragmented picture, even in the way that the artists and the writers talk about themselves. My work on the avant-garde is an attempt to create precisely this larger and coherent picture, to provide a conceptual space for French modernism centered on the concept of the global as one of its main formative elements. The book I'm currently writing, Concepts of the World, the French Avant-Garde and the Idea of the International, limited for the period of the first half of the 20th century, so 1940. So I totally agree with you that after the Second World War, things changed radically. So this book is about the geographical imaginary deployed by writers and artists during this period in France, in and around such avant-garde movements as Futurism, Dadaism, and Surrealism. So for me, the global, I take it differently than what my colleagues talked about before. So instead of turning to global instances of modernism, I'm looking of global imaginaries of one local instance, which is the French one. So in this book, what I want to explore are different conceptions of the world as they were expressed in specific works and as they were informed by broader political, social, and cultural dynamics of the time. Each of these conceptions has been encoded in terms that, while ostensibly embracing the whole world in the sense of the globe, historically developed as different interpretations of this totality. So terms as internationalism, cosmopolitanism, or universalism have come to be used almost interchangeably in contemporary discussions on globalization. In my book, I try to trace the differences among these terms as substantial and meaningful variations that have a considerable effect on the perception and the representation of the world. There are two basic premises in my approach. The first one stems from the obvious but important fact that the conceptualizations of the world are not timeless ideas, but the products or issue of history. The geographical imaginary was also profoundly inflected by historical imaginary, and I would add by political one. And I think, just to continue what you just said before, that historicizing the global should be one of the key tasks within modernist studies today that would permit more nuanced and accurate understandings of what global modernism actually means. And Erica, you just talked about this. The second premise of my work is that modernity and modernism and the avant-garde are best approached as an uneven terrain marked by heterogeneity. This principle of unevenness is a way to see beyond the famous binary of center and periphery that largely dominates considerations of global modernism, and although this was not stated as such in the three previous interventions, it was implied that we have this peripheral modernism that either we see from a central perspective or we try not to see from a central perspective, but this binary is there. In this model, so the center-periphery model, it is usually the periphery that carries the burden of difference, of defying a canonical and homogeneous center. It is through peripheral archives that the unevenness of modernity and of modernism is routinely demonstrated, which pushes into revisions and reconsiderations of modernism in its global iterations. Given the current direction of modernist studies towards peripheral modernisms, one could easily mistake my critical perspective as old-fashioned, for it may appear to construct the global, yet again, from the standpoint of that quintessential center of modernity, France, and specifically Paris. But as mentioned before, this alleged centrality of France in the landscape of global modernism is a persistent ghost, as there is no coherent account of what constituted French modernism. Furthermore, in my work, I avoid the predictable reaction to this scholarly ghostliness, namely the urge to reconstruct Paris as the center, as the capital of the World Republic of Letters, just to quote Casanova as well, as a point of convergence or even as a producer of hegemonic views on the rest of the world. My aim, on the contrary, is on the one hand to map out and define a terrain, that of the French avant-garde, and on the other to interrogate this alleged centrality and illuminate it as itself a site of extraordinary and productive heterogeneity, as a site of unevenness. Indeed, what I show is that the many different ways that the French avant-garde imagined the world demonstrate their own conflicting views about France, and often Europe, within a rapidly changing world. At times, these views are fueled by grandiloquent aspirations to a universality that is dominated by the French spirit, as one would expect from an hegemonic center, but not from a nominally cosmopolitan avant-garde. Elsewhere, however, they are riven by continuous angst of belatedness, backwardness, and derivativeness, all characteristics that are ordinarily associated with peripheral perspectives. In my project, I map out such different and contradictory positions and show that the international project of the avant-garde was polysemic and sometimes ambivalent, reflecting tensions and scissions within the center itself. So my work on the global and the French avant-garde follows thus oddly the two characteristics of global modernist studies that are outlined at the beginning. It stretches the modernist archive to a peculiarly unknown terrain, that of French modernism, while it states that what is presumed to be familiar, what is presumed to be home, France, Europe, might be the place to start for undoing certainties about modernism. Thank you.
I'm grateful to this kind of organization to think of modernism in a different way. And we're all frustrated. We see every book on modernism is Zurich and Paris and London. It's never Beirut, it's never Cairo, it's never Sao Paulo, it's Havana, Buenos Aires, etc. So this answers that a bit. And also, I'm delighted to be with these particular people, and the kind of conversation is already engaged because you're talking about France, and when you jump from Proust to Eliot, right? If you talk about Brazil, it's a totally different scene. So you're jumping from Jarry to Oswald de Andrade. He does Rei da Vela, which is very much King Ubu. You go from Joyce to Mario de Andrade, who was called the futurist poet in the early phases, right? And there's this total intimacy between the two avant-gardes. And that's partly because France was always the cultural mentor for Brazil. It was not the colonial father. Portugal was kind of set aside. So it's a totally different. And then Blaise Cendrars spent a lot of time in Brazil and even wrote film scripts. And there's a Brazilian film, a feature called 100% Brazilian. It's all about Blaise Cendrars and his odysseys there. So when somebody says you have 5 minutes, it concentrates the mind. And it was actually very useful because I realized I could sum up my entire life in words that begin with trance, T-R-A-N-S, but also with trance with a C, because I grew up next to a Pentecostal church in Paterson, New Jersey, where people actually went into trance. The neon light of that church shined into my bedroom window as a kid. Anyway, so some of the trance words, and I was thinking in different periods, it was a different trance, right? So I love Bakhtin, so that was translinguistics, which in the late 20s, he's already anticipating both structuralism and post-structuralism. So I call him a proto-post-structuralist, right, at the end of the 20s. So then Jeanette and transtextuality, another trance, very much part of this idea of recombinant art, where you're I love revisionist adaptations where someone takes Robinson Crusoe and turns it into an anti-colonialist, a bit like Césaire with The Tempest and Une Tempête, etc. So what I'm going to do to save time is show 2 very brief clips, a total of a minute or 2 minutes. And it's from, just a second, let me set it up a bit. It's, anybody seen Terra em Transe, the Brazilian film, Glauber Rocha? Okay, it's from 1966. It's kind of a Baroque allegory, and you know that often Latin America is seen as Baroque. The architecture in Minas Gerais is Baroque. There's Black composers who did Baroque music from Minas in the 18th century at the heights of the silver boom. And lately, that's become fashionable again with Deleuze talking about the Baroque, or you have digital Baroque, etc. So this is kind of a Baroque allegory, and it's literally allegorical because it looks like Brazil, but it's set in El Dorado, right? And you have a modernist reference because he thought of calling it Mal Dourado, a reference to Chão de Mal d'Ouro, and El Dorado. And in Portuguese, it also sort of means mal adorado, badly loved, or mal dourado, which would be badly gilded. So it's so resonant, but I think he thought that was a bit too artsy to attract an audience. So his work is a prime example of transnational modernism. Both Brazilian modernism of the 20s modernists, the famous phrase I'm sure you've all heard from Oswald de Andrade in 1928, tupi or not tupi, that is the question. So this variation on Hamlet, the Tupi Indians, people, it doesn't mean to urinate or not urinate, but should we be Indians or pale faces? Should we imitate Europe or not? So I think these, and his gurus were very much modernists, Eisenstein, Brecht, Orson Welles. And like Orson Welles, they were both kind of child prodigies. At age 10, Glauber Rocha was writing letters about, I don't quite agree with the pessimism of Nietzsche. Whoops, I'm sorry. And he was writing poems, and he's kind of a multi-artist like Wells, and both at 20 did these kind of revolutionary pieces. You have the Voodoo Macbeth in Harlem in 1936, and then you have Barravento, which is also all black, like the Voodoo Macbeth, in 1962. So let's see the first clip, which is the opening of the film. The sound is coming. This shows the power of religious music from West Africa to totally transform an image, right? You could imagine this same image with, the girl from Ipanema, right? It would become a touristic commercial. But this combines the airplane with this music from Candomblé in Yoruba, so it's translingual. And they transform each other. So it brings back the memory of slavery, the Middle Passage. It recapitulates the Middle Passage in a way, but in a plane. But the music brings that historical, cultural memory. Now, this film actually inspired other artists in different forms to instantly react. So Elio Oiticica, if you know his work, his installations came almost immediately after. Zé Celso in the Oficina Theater. He's the one who did the kind of Jarry-style King of the Candle. Even the candle, remember, Ubu says, de par ma chandelle verte, right, which is this very phallic symbol. And then Tropicalia in music. So they were all very explicit about it. So Caetano, if you've read his memoir, whoops. Anyway, I'll just tell you what he said. No, I'll look for it. I don't have nails. Huh? Everybody knows Caetano Veloso's music, the most erudite, danceable music in the world. He plays with Heidegger in his lyrics. He dialogues with Roberto Schwartz and makes puns referring to Roberto Schwartz. Anyway, he wrote, you can read this in his memoir, that whole tropicalist thing became clear to me the day I saw Terra Entranci. My heart exploded during the opening sequence when, to the sound of a candomblé chant, an aerial shot brings us to the coast of Brazil. Without that traumatic moment, tropicalism would have never come into existence. So this whole movement was kind of born under the sign of the Black Atlantic, kind of an epiphany of transoceanic blackness. So I call this aesthetic trance modernism, punning on trance as possession and going beyond. He's one of many artists. Well, let me make a different point. Another trance is trance artistic, that no art can have the monopoly or discipline on talking about modernism. It's multi-art. Of course, cinema is multi-art by definition because you have different tracks. So the image track brings the whole history of the image, pictorial arts. The performance brings theater. Music brings the history of music, etc. So it's interesting that you have these multi-art talents like Rocha or Orson Welles or Maya Deren or Wole Soyinka, who are inspired by West African religions. And I think it's also because those religions are themselves multi-artistic, because they involve narrative, they involve poetry, they involve dance, they involve performance, and the so-called low arts of cuisine and costume, right? So I think there's a real resonance between the artists themselves and then this form of religion. And Rocha said he admired the mise-en-scène of Candomblé, which he presents in his first film, Barravento, in 1962. And even that word comes from trance, because Barravento can mean storm, or it can also mean the moment of disorientation before the onset of trance, kind of a dizziness. So it's referring to both. So he has two films where trance is literally in the title. Now, I think Erica was talking about spiral time, because I think there's a danger in the word modernism that sets a kind of trap, which is a stagist trap. Because the book I just did is about aesthetics, but I start with the commons, then I go to the carnivalesque, which are all very old and perpetual and new, and then I put modernism in the third chapter precisely to avoid this idea of the cult of the new. You know, what's after modernism? You have the post and then the post-post. So you're in kind of a Hegelian trap. Remember, he said there are prehistorical peoples. They don't have a state. They don't have literacy. So I think we want to avoid that trap. Anyway, just about Candomblé, you know, I talk about archaic modernism, but Candomblé is not really archaic. It's just been around for a long time, but it changes. It's not as if you have the modern, which changes, and then you have Candomblé, which is eternal and changeless. No, actually, they're both changing. And there are theorists who talk about the fact that Candomblé is more feminist than the Abrahamic religions. You have a female principle, a male principle. You have female orishas. It's more queer-friendly as well. There's a filmmaker named Eunice Gutmann who they get together and talk about different religions and say Candomblé is actually not patriarchal. It's not rooted in a father. And this literature goes back to Ruth Landis in the 40s, who wrote a book called City of Women. And she talks about the power of women of the Mai de Santo in Candomblé. Also, there are those who say it's more scientific because it talks about Ashe, about energy, not about, the world was created in 7 days. Karen Barber, if you know, is it his or her? Her, I think, right? Anybody know? No. Anyway, she talks about the fact that it's deconstructionist because indeterminacy is built into the rituals themselves. They're never totally rigid. They're open in form. Okay. The next sequence, which is also very brief, brings a new twist to this whole idea of kind of this magic realist approach to aesthetics. So this is a dream fantasy sequence in the mind of the protagonist, who's an intellectual poet filmmaker. Let's see it and then we'll talk about it. Okay. Very striking sequence. And some of what's happening in this sequence, first of all, the man in the center here has a Mexican name, Porfirio Diaz, famous Mexican ruler. So Glauber Rocha is saying the allegory is not just about Brazil, it's about Latin America in general, right? So it's trans Latin America. The Indian figure here you'll notice there's a lot of regalia, because you see a lot of films about Columbus where the so-called Indians are always naked, right? And often, if you see the 1949 Hollywood Columbus, they're worshipful. They just imitate everything Europeans do. They don't even speak to each other. So Columbus's parrot speaks much more than the native people. So here, you notice a difference. This is a very proud figure that the Indian has as much regalia as the French monarch, the French guy, or sorry, French, it's Portuguese. The reason I refer to France is that the French were allied with the Tupinamba, and they received their head, Kunyambebe, as a kind of monarch. He was honored. And this regalia you can see in the Quai Branly Museum. If you go to Paris, you'll see this exact André Thevet in the 16th century brought this clothing to Paris. So what else is happening in the sequence? Does anyone recognize it? Anyone who knows Brazil, what's being restaged? It's a Primeira Missa. It's kind of a Brazilian Thanksgiving. It's the first Mass, which Cabral supposedly celebrated with the indigenous people, right? And that's very iconic in Brazil. So in the 80s, the Cruzeiro had a famous painting called A Primeira Missa, which, by the way, was an imitation of Horace Vernet. I forget what it's called, Messe en Algérie. So you get this colonial circulation between French Algeria and Brazil, and it was painted in Paris in 1860. So this is very iconic. Any Brazilian will recognize, oh, it's the first Mass, right? So what Rocha does, he fuses Cabral with the right-winger who's part of the coup d'etat in 1964. So this is kind of a mutually impacting metaphor. It's as if the conquest was a coup d'etat, and the coup d'etat continues the conquest. So there's this continuum. Also, history is embodied in costume. I mentioned the regalia. It's also, this is a sequence that grows with me. So the more I know, the more I see in this sequence. So it's interesting to know that there's an Indian here, but in Brazil, so-called Indians could not represent themselves because they had the legal status of children. So it was only with the 1980 Constitution that, when I say Indians, a lot of people are mixed in Brazil, but Indians who lived, autonomously could only travel with passports and meet other indigenous activists and filmmakers after 1988. So back then, guess who represented Indians? Black Brazilians, right? So, and this only changed much later in the game. So, this idea of transtextuality, recombinant art, Glauber was a prolific writer and coiner of wonderful phrases. So he coined a term, surrealismo, which is a play with a Spanish word for south, sur. So, and he said he wants a surrealism for the global south, not just an imitation, but a new global south surrealism. Also, it's good to know that this sequence is also kind of a parody or exaggeration of another Brazilian film called Discovery of Brazil, which is very pious, very Christian, very idealizing the conquest. So he's dialoguing with this other text on the same subject. So you'll see that's very Brechtian, right? You have a very stylized staging. You have anachronisms, this aesthetic of anachronism. You have modern dress, but you have conquistadores. It's anti-naturalistic, and Glauber was literally post-Brechtian because he loved Brecht. He saw Drei Groschen Oper in '60, and he was part of that, but he's also going beyond Brecht through trance. So Rocha really Africanizes Brecht, carnivalizes Brecht, tropicalizes Brecht, indigenized, and I would say intersectionalizes, that's hard to pronounce, a little tribute to Kimberly Crenshaw. And here, it's so transnational because so much is involved. You have French, you have Tupinamba, you have Africa, you have indigenous people, you have Europe, various European nations competing to dominate Brazil, etc. And you have kind of a transcultural dissonance as an artistic resource.
Now Kelly and I are going to just pose one or two questions to the panelists before opening it up for discussion, and I'm sure some of you have responses to each other's presentations. My question is a little bit irreverent, but recurred in a lot of these talks, and is something that I struggle with both in the formation of this group and in my own work, which is if the term modernism is useful or accurate for describing the kind of work that we do. And I'm thinking about this in a few ways. First of all, this idea of the time of modernism. Erica mentioned perhaps going back to the 15th century. I've heard some of you talk about work in the 60s, 70s, 80s. So is this useful as a temporal marker of any kind? And also, this goes back to what Robin was saying about the self-consciousness of self-identifying as modernist. And you mentioned, Robin, the Spanish context. I would also say in the Latin American, in Brazil, and even in the North American context, people did identify as modernism, at least in my own work, looking at these questions that people were issuing to their contributors through magazines in the 1920s. But more prevalent certainly was the term avant-garde, which Effie mentions in her work and centralizes, and to me has always been a term that's much more self-consciously adopted in the early 20th century, and has always been more explicitly international in scope. So part of the aspiration to be part of the avant-garde, or to announce that you're part of the avant-garde, whether you be in Japan or Spain or in France, is to participate in something that is international or perhaps transnational in scope. So I'm wondering if that's a more useful term. And also this speaks to what Effie was saying, that for me, often modernism is a term that comes out of not only Anglo-American studies, but literature specifically. So I'm wondering if that applies to work in cinema and the visual arts, if it applies to different geographies that might not be self-consciously identifying as modernist, or if it is an academic or disciplinary term that is useful just in the context of trying to establish oneself in a field and to find one's interlocutors. So I'm curious to know if this, I know we kind of thrust this upon you for the purposes of our discussion, but if this is a term that you use in your work, or if you found alternative ways of formulating your own position vis-a-vis your discipline or field that might be more useful.
I basically kind of sidestep the issue by treating these actors as calling them what they call themselves. I mean, I'm in the enviable position in some sense of not having to deal with that problem, because if they call themselves modernists, then they're modernists. And I mean, my own studies are pretty concretely historical, and I do think that when Octavio Paz is writing at the same period, he's talking about modernism very explicitly. So modernism it's a kind of I have a sort of philological, I suppose, approach to it, in the sense that I'm really looking at, what does modernism, or its translation into Arabic in this case, what does it mean in a particular moment? How is it used? What does it translate? That kind of thing. I also think in the Arabic context, it's particularly, I suppose, important just because al-hadatha, which is the Arabic word for modernity or modernism, that is to say aesthetic modernism, or the kind of political social processes that we call modernity, is still kind of pretty much a burning issue. I mean, it's a focus of debate, and it's pretty much agreed on by almost everybody, whether or not you are nationalist, Marxist, internationalist, apolitical, that it's something to have, that it's something that you want to be, which is to say modern or get modernity. And but I think that one of the benefits of looking at these terms historically is to put that sort of ambition under a certain kind of scrutiny, and to say that it does belong to a particular genealogy and historical project. And I actually think that in the Arab context, for certain, where really what you hear so often about the Middle East is that there's a kind of lack of modernity, that there's some gap of modernity, which is often blamed on Islam or something. That it's important to go back into the debates themselves, in this case in the 1950s, to say, well, there's a long history actually of debates about what modernism means, and it's not merely in the Anglo-Saxon context.
In my case too, for this specific book, I'm also lucky because the avant-garde is neat. Is very neat. I mean, they call themselves avant-garde. There are other problems there. For instance, what is the relation of avant-garde and modernism? Or is there a unified avant-garde? What can put together, for instance, futurism and light surrealism, if anything? There are other issues. But I like very much a quote that I actually have with me by Susan Stanford Friedman about modernism, when she says that the terminological quagmire of modernist studies may be the result of a transferential process in which people become caught in a repetition of the unresolved contradictions present and largely repressed in modernity itself. So there is all this debate about what modernism is, because there is a debate about what modernity is. But whether we like this term or not, the term is here to stay. So it has become a scholarly term, it has become a field. So in my opinion, we have to use it as a conceptual tool. And then how we use it and how we define it, will give it more heft. So for instance, for the next project that I'm hoping to start, which is about French modernist poetry, I am going to use it. And I really don't know how, because as I said before, this doesn't exist in France. I mean, how do you draw a line between, I don't know, Baudelaire, let's say, if it is the beginning, and Paul Valéry, who is supposed to be modernist, or Perse, as you mentioned before. So I do think that it's problematic, but it is there, and it has created a space for itself, and I think that we should work with it.
So, I think when we're talking about this term modernist, I think it's important for us to kind of think about to the extent to which it overlaps with the avant-garde and to the extent to which it actually is placed in contradiction to the avant-garde. Because I think we can see this as both ways. As both Robin and I have talked about, and I think some other panelists here, modernism does emerge primarily as a retrospective term, and one that's used to consolidate certain types of particularly literature, and as I point out, particularly within the academy here, as opposed to the avant-garde, which always has a much more radical connotation, I think, than, say, Eleatic modernism, and particularly a tight connection with certain types of political radicalism. So, for instance, it's not at all accidental that Grove Press is publishing Fanon, right? That there's some kind of dialogue back and forth between certain types of art and literature and politics that are seen as radical in nature. And modernism doesn't always have that particular connotation. At times it does, and I think those writers who want to rehabilitate the term oftentimes are looking at modernism as something that does have a certain type of, as Friedman would say, a certain type of resistant quality to it, something that provokes, something that's pushed against a particular kind of mainstream culture, but it's also one that at times is used with a large degree of cultural capital. And I think this is one of the real troublesome spots about modernism, is that if we begin to expand the word modernism, are we also tacitly endorsing certain types of cultural capital, particularly ones that emerged from, say, early 20th century Europe, rather than using some kind of other terms to describe those kinds of experimentation. So I think modernism itself is somewhat, it's a problematic term, but I think it's also a useful one, and I think that's what's really important to get at.
I think one way to see the politics of modernism is for the idea of the two avant-gardes, one being political, the other being aesthetic. Yeah. And they're sometimes in sync and sometimes they're not. So you have these high points like the Soviet Union in the 20s, maybe France of the 60s, that they sort of converge, but then they split entirely. So you get somebody like Pound, who's very almost fascist, et cetera. Eliot, who's quite conservative. So that's one way to look at it. I find Peter Berger's analysis of high and low modernism, and one is kind of cubist, artsy, and the other is kind of funky and disturbs the institutions of art. I find that useful. When I use the term, I almost always qualify it some way that scrambles it. So I talk about paramodernism, archaic modernism, potlatch modernism. So it's always sort of there, but it's questioning at the same time. In terms of temporality, if anybody's read the Laura Marx book, and I don't know, I'm not an Iranian specialist, but she compares the latest installations to a mosque in, I forget, 11th century in Iran, right? Saying aesthetically they're the same. They have the same effect on the spectator, et cetera. Just one more comment. I was just on a PhD defense at Columbia about Iranian cinema. And thanks to Farbad, who wrote it, I discovered Ali Ahmad, who was kind of pushing back against modernism, sort of endorsing but questioning it. And he had wonderful coinages like occidentosis, Westoxification. So you get pushback even in the terminology itself.
I actually just want to say a few words. It's just, I think that the word modernism is very useful. We've always grappled with it in my field. To claim modernity is an issue and is constantly in play. So there are writers that I work with that have essays entitled "We Have Always Been Modern," and then others that said we were never modern, and so there's something, but I find that there's something very useful about that sort of grappling with the term, because I don't think it's something that can stand still right now, and especially for cultures, arts that in a sense existed outside of the narrative of the avant-garde, that sort of forward movement that we're constantly grappling with in art history, this sort of Western canon. So it's something that's still in play. It's a term that's still in play, that's still useful, and maybe we haven't found another word for what's happening or what is to be described, but I'm constantly trying to think of one that is less confining in some ways and less amorphous in other ways. It's a strange kind of term because it can be useful in one way and in other ways just everything just falls apart. So anyway.
Well, one thing a definition of modernism that I've always liked is that word belated, which came up a few times in people's talks. And it seems that the field of modernism is always trying to redefine itself in reaction to something that has just happened or is in the process of happening. So I guess my question is maybe a little bit unfair, but this is a state of the field, and I feel like I'm still not certain what the field of modernism even is, but is there any way for us to kind of project 10 years down the road? And I'm asking this question in part for undergraduates and new graduate students who are interested in the field of modernism or global modernism. Where does modernism find a home down the road? We're coming to this often from particular area studies or particular, fields of literature or film or art history, but we're also talking about modernism in a way that seems to want to defy all those fields. So what does a graduate student who wants to go into, modernist studies do? And is there some place where this conversation kind of goes to? What kind of conversation are we going to have in 10 years, I guess?
I would say mix it up with something else. Scramble it, connect it, transnationalize it.
I think the issue of history is very important, and we all talked about this. So historicizing what the global actually means, and not actually stand from the perspective of the now to understand what the global was 50 years ago, 100 years ago, or even the 15th century. So I think that at least this is something that will start happening more and more, and nuancing not only the history of global processes, but also modernism as a historical phenomenon, and which will contextualize what the first two speakers were talking about, so the fact that, for instance, in modernist studies now you can talk about a contemporary author, but you can also talk about a late 19th century author, and they're both modernists, and you can talk about both of them with the same more or less theoretical apparatus. So historicizing also modernism, I think, will be a direction that things will go, or at least I hope.
I think in part, modern studies will, at least the goal, and this may be an idealistic goal that is not one that's fully achieved, but it's going to look more like comparative literature. And I think that's one of the currents that, at least within literary studies, is definitely there in the field, that there's a constant push to expand boundaries, not just within the Anglophone world, but also within minor languages. And that's something that, despite all the rhetoric of the global and the global turn in modern studies, really has not been the case a ton. I mean, if you look at journals like Modernism, Modernity, or even Modernist Cultures, a large percentage of the languages being worked in are still English, French, Spanish, Italian, right, German, right. There's not a whole lot, maybe a little bit in some Indian languages, but there's still a large amount of work to be done within those other languages, and I think that's where the field eventually is going to need to go. I think we have a certain emerging canon of Anglophone text, something that would include, say, Mukherjee, some of the Nigerian writers from the 50s and 60s, certainly Caribbean writers like Rees, McKay. But I think those non-English literatures, and particularly non-European languages, have been much slower to be incorporated into the field. And I think that's one direction where it needs to go, and hopefully will go.
We have maybe 10 minutes, as long as the panelists are holding up okay, for questions from the audience. So if you have a question, just raise your hand and we'll bring a mic to you.
Ooh, boy, sorry. I was trying to take the advice, Kelly's advice, but I guess I took it too seriously. So thank you very much for this interesting panel, and I'm just trying to build off a couple of things that I'm hearing, which I thought were very interesting. And this idea that I guess Robin was bringing up started us off with the autonomy of art and thinking of freeing it from its national contexts. Kind of makes sense in the national context with which we were dealing at the beginning of the 20th century. The United States starts forced sterilizations of individuals to protect racial purity. The 1924 Immigration Act is entitled the Racial Purity Act. There's lots of crimes that are done in the name of nations and of race. And so I can understand why artists might want to maybe free themselves of this national trajectory and thinking about that in the global context, other nationalities and other artistic groups thinking of joining in with this through the mediums of print, newspapers, journals, cinema, and all of these being joined together by this international mail network of being able to send this stuff around. And so in some ways I can understand wanting to get rid of this national context. And on the other hand, I wonder if it's essentially hegemonic. And I think I'm thinking about Matthew's one of his comments at the end here, that maybe we are not really seeing the same kind of vanguard or the avant-garde, but maybe seeing some kind of more of a reactionary phase. And so I'm wondering in this international context, if you could speak to maybe this loss of, or this desire to get rid of national boundaries, and how this might or might not be in itself essentially hegemonic, if we're encouraging other nationalities to engage in this public sphere conversation that's tied together through international trade networks.
I could say something which will probably be more suggestive than concrete, but I think one of the reasons why I suspect that it's best to think about some sort of globalization of modernism as a literary ideology having to do with the autonomy of the poetic happens when it does, which is to say the post-World War II period has everything to do with the Cold War. It has everything to do with the sudden division of the world into really two major camps, which are to say the free world, the capitalist free world, and the communist and the second world. And in the realm of culture, this had very concrete kind of instantiations, which is to say that, for instance, and this is again coming at things through my peculiar angle of the Lebanese modernist group. But this was one of the many groups that had dealings with the Congress for Cultural Freedom, which is what was eventually known to be a CIA-financed cultural organization that was basically trying to woo leftist intellectuals all over the world, mostly in Europe, but also in Lebanon, in Japan, in Africa. I mean, Transition and Black Orpheus, these magazines that I mentioned, were funded by the CCF, and so was the magazine that I'm talking. Well, it wasn't, but it was. They wanted it to be. In any case, I think that when we're talking about internationalism, the point is that there was actually an institutional form for achieving that kind of global reach, which is to say, and this is only one instance, but this network of magazines funded by Congress for Cultural Freedom, you could have an article written for the magazine in Uganda that would be simultaneously published, and this is, I think, historically novel, simultaneously published in Encounter in London, Preuve in France, Der Monat in Berlin, Cuadernos in Latin America, and Hiwar in Beirut, and it could be simultaneously published in all of these different translations. And this actually happened. I mean, it happened in many, many cases. Orwell, for instance, achieved a kind of global fame through this institutional form of literature, which is also another reason why I think magazines are so important. So I think that's one of the reasons why studying magazines is important, and historicizing what we mean by globalization, because it means something very particular, and it has institutional backing of a particular sort.
Thank you for some really interesting remarks from all of you. I would like to follow up a little bit on Matthew Etoff's comments about cultural capital and the academy and the role of modernism within the formation of the academy, really to ask, how do we make sure we're doing enough to become self-reflexive about that connection? How do we do enough to defamiliarize ourselves and stop that very comfortable fit between modernist values and the disciplines from which we were born and our work was born? So I'm thinking partly about responses to modernity that don't look avant-garde, that don't look modernist, that get kind of wiped out of that narrative of modernity. And how do we ensure that we're thinking about those things? How do we ensure that we're constantly present to those vicious circles, or perhaps virtuous circles for us modernists, but vicious circles in our thinking, really?
So there's a really interesting article that Simon Gaikhandi wrote a couple of years ago that I think really speaks to this, which is, I think this came out in MLQ, I'm not positive, but Gaikhandi talks about the formation of realism versus modernism versus the Romance within and across Africa in the late 19th and early 20th century. And one of his points is that actually realism looks way more modernist in some ways to many particular African cultures than modernism does. That in some ways, particularly some of the Romance elements that modernism is able to incorporate a little bit more easily than realism is, have a much longer tradition in some of these cultures. And that, in fact, particularly say for the anti-colonial movements of the 50s and 60s, think someone like Gugi's work, that a particular type of realist perspective actually seems in some ways like it's breaking formal boundaries or pushing certain types of modernities in a way that modernism isn't at that time. And I think that's a really interesting contradiction to think about. We tend to place modernism and realism on a very particular type of linear scale that does not actually, I think, fit necessarily the way that they've grown, which is that realism is that thing that happened in the 18th and 19th centuries, and then we eventually get modernism, and then we get postmodernism, as several panelists have already talked about here. And that's not particularly what happens if we look at cultures across the world. That, in fact, things that look modernist and things that look realist are on a very different time scale. And so I think that's one way to think about it, is to actually think about realism as something that is not the thing that comes before modernism, but then is actually something that's formed in tension with modernism across this period.
Yeah, just kind of reinforcing that point. I think Brecht was a key figure because he was pro-realist, but realism for him was showing the causal network of social events. And he was also reflexive at the same time. So it's no accident that Brecht was such a huge figure in the global South. People like Simben is very Brechtian, a lot of Brazilians, Cubans, etc.
Yeah, a lot of the market theater in South Africa, very Brechtian influenced.
Exactly.
I think it's also important for us to sort of interrogate our terms. And one of the words that or concepts I've been fighting with for the last few months now is the picturesque, for instance, in the context of the Caribbean, because it's always used, that someone would look at a painting and say, oh, that's so picturesque, in a very pejorative way, And what does it take for me as a scholar to sort of question that history of looking? What does it take for me to, in a sense, shift things around and at least consider a different point of departure in relation to that image? And it's difficult, but I think we have to be attentive to those moments where we sort of just go into what we know and just apply without giving any sort of consideration to the subaltern, quote unquote, or a native eye, or I think you have to look from different, you almost have to be like a cubist painting, I guess, look at something with a sense of simultaneity. And that may add a little bit of rigor that I think we've been missing.
Yeah, just to add on this and also sort of respond to the previous question, there's a series of associations that are connected with what modernist work should be. A good modernist work should be international. A good modernist work should be about the cities, urban. It's not rural, for instance. If it is rural, it's reactionary. It's not modernist. It talks about something that has not to do with modernity. But if you actually look at the works themselves, these kind of characterizations do not stand. Actually, you can be modernist and you can have an understanding of the global and global aspiration and be an ardent nationalist and not be a fascist. So you don't have to be a futurist, for instance, and a fascist futurist to be a nationalist. And being a nationalist implies actually a vision of the whole world. It is a position. You have the world in your mind, but from a nationalist perspective. And the same thing, for instance, for the rural or the picturesque, as you said. It doesn't mean that there is a certain set of positions that make something modernist. And I think this is something that is being now unpacked more and more within modernist studies. For instance, the nation in non-peripheral modernisms. I'm thinking of Pericles Lewis here. And I think this is part of the work to be done over the next 10 years, just to go back to what you said.
Just picking up on that last comment quick. This rural can be treated in a modernist fashion, right? So there's an Iranian film, The Cow, which you don't see one sign of modernity in the film, and yet it's completely modernist. And Farbod points out that you had a kind of painting at the time which had real mud, and mud is the dominant in The Cow. Some of the first phase of Brazilian Cinema Novo was totally rural and totally modernist. And he would use these forms like cordel, which goes back to the Middle Ages, but then point out the resonance between the pre-modern and the modern. Because if it's anti-realist, which the tradition was, what's more modern than that? So.
Maybe we'll do one more question, and then we can continue conversation afterwards too with some food and wine as well.
Really appreciated the discussion. Thank you very much for a very provocative set of questions that you raised. In light of the last few comments, I wonder whether the juxtaposition of global and modernism is really so innocent. One needs to really think about how each term is mobilized and how it travels as a unit. And so it made me think about actually the word, something that Robin said, the word international being used as, I think you said, a way of defining modernity and as something to have. It really made me think of the post-colonial context in India, when to be international in a sort of a Nehruvian mode of development was to be the opposite of localism, the opposite of being parochial. So to be international, to have a sort of a serial sense of nations, in sort of an Anderson kind of way, was in fact to be cosmopolitan. So Satyajit Ray, for example, Home in the World, the mimicry of Europeans being part of being the international. To the sort of global moment when it falls into, I really like Bob's notion of falling into the trap of being modern as a prerequisite to entering the global. So which is what the whole discussion in India today is, to have a certain sense of the modern in order to enter the global. So just a thought that perhaps we need to think about how this moves as a sort of a unit and how it travels.
Well, I mean, the basic premise of the book I'm writing right now is that different terms to describe the world describe a different world. So precisely what you said, that no concept is innocent. And cosmopolitan is not the same thing as internationalist, is not the same thing as universalist, for instance. They imply a different, not only imagination of the world, but different position of the specific subject within this world, and a different understanding of the relation between different parts of the world. And of course, issues of colonialism, of empire enter into this. So I do believe that we need to distinguish these terms, again, historicize them, see how they come out of a historical context and how they're used in a historical context to project onto what I say world as a more neutral term, but of course it's not a neutral term, but is a little bit less neutral than everything else, just to describe the earth or but yes, I totally agree with you that these are very charged terms that have a lot of history and specific politics attached to them, and we need just to unpack them.
Yeah, I would just kind of, as a note, say that on this question of kind of the philology of world or the philology of the global, that the Arab poets I work on often have this kind of figure that crops up over and over in their essays of Arabic poetry, knocking on the world, knocking on the door of the world to get in, and precisely the way that you say that to become modern is in some sense to become global. But and picking up on the last point of kind of historicizing. For them, it's always the first world. It's not the second world. So it's a very particular kind of ideological context of what the world means. It means to be knocking on the door of certain kinds of circuits of European and American and Latin American poetic networks. That's what the world means. The world never means everything in the world, right? It means a particular kind.
Yeah, I mean, I would just add really quickly that, say, in much of the African context, the drive towards modernism is a lack of nationhood. Modernist aesthetics really pick up when certain types of anti-popular dictatorships start to rise in the 1970s, and particularly in reaction to the apartheid regime and popular protests against it in the 70s and 80s. And particularly with certain educated writers who feel themselves as being in a really uncomfortable position in relation to that regime. On the one hand, privilege, on the other hand, in opposition, or at least politically somewhat in opposition to the apartheid regime. So I think in the African context, particularly with the influence of Fanani and nationalism, that's definitely one of the things going on there, is that I think there is a large connection to the discourse of nationalism and to the hope, the promise of nationalism going on with modernist aesthetics.
Thank you all so much for coming, and please join us for a quick reception afterwards.